So let's look at what is futures thinking. The only way to discover the limits of the possible is to go beyond them into the impossible. And they're the words of Arthur C. Clarke, science fiction writer. Now, what exactly is futures thinking, and why am I saying futures plural and not future thinking? Well, in this lecture, we're going to look at what futures thinking is and the terminology used in the futures field. And by the end of the lecture, you're going to have a good understanding of the core concepts of futures thinking. So let's look at terminology. Now, I have to say that the terminology used in the futures thinking field can be confusing, so I want to address this issue up front in the course. Now, it's important to understand the key concepts and not get distracted or put off by various words used by various authors. My view is that it's far more important to understand the concepts and their use to improve our lives, to improve our organizations and society, rather than splitting hairs on the exact meaning of different terms. So futures thinking is also referred to as foresight, strategic foresight, futuristics, future studies, futuring, and the outdated term futurology. Now, whilst there are some differences in how futures thinking is practiced within these diverse notions, in general, the terms can be considered synonymous, and I want to be clear about that straight away in the course. Now, the term strategic foresight is often used, and I'm going to use this interchangeably with futures thinking in this course. Now, practitioners in the field of futures thinking are known as futurists. Now, futurists collaborate with businesses, governments, and other partners to explore future scenarios and help people think about and prepare for things that haven't happened yet. So, in other words, the future, or futures, multiple futures. Now, let's look at what futures thinking means in our day-to-day lives, because we often think of the future, but most of our commonplace future thinking is about the near future. The next few minutes, the next few hours, days, weeks, months, or maybe even the next few years of our lives. We're talking about, few mental cycles, if any, are spent thinking about what our lives are going to be like or what actions we should prepare to take in the far future. And here I'm talking about 10 years, 20 years, or even 50 years from now. So according to the World Future Studies Federation, futures thinking is the systematic study of alternative futures, including the worldviews and myths that underlie each future. And before we go further, let me define a few more terms. Prediction. A prediction is what someone thinks is going to happen. A prediction is a forecast, but not only about the weather. So pre means before, and diction has to do with talking. So a prediction is a statement about the future. And by the way, a forecast is a time-based prediction, such as the weather forecast. Predictions about the future may allow us to make decisions, but can also contain biases and blind spots. Now, according to Jim Dator, a well-known futurist, the future cannot be accurately predicted simply because the future does not exist. Forecasts and predictions are not well suited to today's conditions in the world because we're experiencing a lot of disruption. And, they project the future in a linear way that is not reflected in reality. And we aren't taught to examine the future through different lenses. Instead, we tend to believe that tomorrow will most likely be a version of today, anchoring our planning and assumptions on what we know and what we can see. Now, in the mid-1980s, political scientist Philip Tetlock decided to put experts' predictions to the test. He recruited hundreds of academics and pundits who spent their lives thinking about politics and signed them up to forecasting tournaments. Now, over time, these forecasts were tested against reality to see exactly how accurate they were, and it turned out that the experts just weren't good at anticipating events. And Tetlock showed that foreign affairs experts were as accurate at predicting events as random chance or guesswork, and that the more sure the experts seemed, the more wrong they turned out to be. So let's get back to then futures thinking. Futures thinking is a cross-disciplinary approach to considering potential futures through the exploration of trends and drivers for change that may lead to different future scenarios. Now, this includes evaluating what scenarios are possible, plausible, probable, and preferable futures. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to come back to these in section 2 of the course. Future studies also looks at ideas about future or images of the future which each individual and group has, often holding several conflicting images at one time. Now, if we had to summarize future-orientated thinking in 3 points, this is what I would like to say. So number 1, there are many possible futures. So in the last 50 years or so, the study of the future has moved from predicting or forecasting the future to mapping alternative futures to shaping desired futures. Now, the future is ceasing to be understood as a predefined place to which we are heading or as a destiny from which we cannot escape. Now we are starting to understand, although it seems obvious, that it is more a matter of a horizon of possibilities and probabilities that are gradually woven together through our collective actions. We should think about the future in plural, hence futures thinking. There's no single track which we're on. Single clear predictions give a false sense of certainty. The future is possible, plausible, probable, and preferable. Considering all 4 types of futures yields a far more comprehensive and insightful forward view. Now, as I said, we're going to look at these in more detail in section 2. Now, the second point about futures thinking is that the future is open. Now, futurists frequently state that the future is open, by which they mean it's not fixed, and we have opportunities and freedom to influence the future in a positive direction. Another way of putting this is that there are no facts about the future. Futures thinking is not about predicting the future accurately. We can influence the future because the future does not just happen by itself. Rather, the future is shaped by our actions and decisions in the present. The future is also shaped by the things we don't do. And of course, that brings to mind problems that we have, like, for example, procrastination. Now, the assumption of an open future offers hope and opportunity. Positive change is possible. The future is a domain of freedom and empowerment because we can choose and act to bring about a desirable future. We need to view the future as a set of multiple trajectories that are being built and which can therefore be influenced or at least perturbed in the present. So emphasis is not on what will happen, but on what could happen. And now we move on to point number 3. We are responsible for thinking long term. And this is particularly important with regard to future generations. We can't simply focus on the present or the near future. We do have a duty to act to create a future that is better, not worse, than the present. Today, there's a growing global movement to protect future generations. Sweden introduced a Ministry of the Future in 2014. Wales introduced a Future Generations Commissioner, and I've put a link in the resources for more information. Scotland also decided to appoint a Future Generations Commissioner in 2021, and the United Arab Emirates made a similar commitment to future generations through the Ministry of Cabinet Affairs and the Future. The problem is that when we're too focused on the present, we think the way things are now are going to last forever. And you see this in companies all the time, this short-termism, focus on weekly bonuses, quarterly reports. For example, maybe you've gone into an interview and they ask you, where do you see yourself in 10 years' time? But the people asking the questions haven't thought about it for their own lives or the businesses that they work in. We need to take a longer view of time to see deeper patterns of change. So we take the long view, at least 10 years out. Some may take a shorter time frame, say at least 5 years, but I prefer 10 years. This allows us to stretch our thinking and imagination. In 10 years, everything is possible. In most cases, strategic foresight focuses on the time frame roughly, therefore, between 10 and 40 years from now. And that is where things are definitely not very predictable, but also not completely unknown to us. And there are many things that are likely to stay the same in 40 years from now. Reflect back 40 years ago and see, what is still there or what is the same and what is different compared to 40 years ago. So if we look at tomorrow or next month, things are likely going to be pretty much the same. If we look at the 22nd century, it's going to be much harder to say anything about life in the 22nd century. So the further away in the future, the more uncertain and the less predictable it's going to be. In contrast, most strategic or operational planning focuses on only the 1 to 3 year time frame. And this is because this time frame seems to be more of a continuation of the present trends, and we tend to be more comfortable in this time frame in the sense that it's more in our comfort zone. So learning about futures is learning about change. And many other disciplines also study change. We have chemical reactions, is a study of change. We have evolution of species, that's a study of change, or the development of a child. And two disciplines in particular study change in a way that is most related to the future. We have history, which studies change in the past times, and journalism reports change in the present. And by the same token, future studies, looks at possible futures. The difference is that historians and journalists have direct evidence of change that they are studying. Historians can use written records and physical evidence of all kinds to make inference about, their object of study. Journalists can also use all kinds of data sources, including observation and interviews. And futures thinking goes from personal to global futures. The range of potential spheres of interest in futures thinking can include personal, local, regional, national, and global planetary futures. Futures thinking and strategic planning. I just want to mention something about that because, that's an obvious situation where we often look at futures thinking, and that's in relation to strategic planning. And many, of course, companies and organizations develop strategic plans. So it's common for business and organizations, as I mentioned, to plan for the future. Now, futures thinking or strategic foresight is not the same thing as strategic planning, but is a foundation for it. Strategic planning relies largely on spreadsheet-based models to extrapolate historical performance into a linear future plan. And we must choose one official future from among many possibilities and tie our fortunes to that one decision. Beyond their inability to accurately forecast the future, these traditional models are dangerous, when they proclaim one definitive future, effectively blinding leaders to all threats and opportunities outside their narrow view. Now, in our current environment, we certainly must hold tight to our vision and mission, but we can't stubbornly cling to the strategies that reinforce our official future. By attempting to forecast the future in a linear manner, we create an official future mindset that leaves us blind to outside opportunities and threats. And it should be no surprise that this relic from the 19th century is unable to keep pace with our 21st century world. So just another point then on futures thinking. The future is in our heads. Like the past, the future is a construct in our minds. The human capability to create mental images of totally other things, that which has never been experienced or recorded, is the key dynamic of history. And thought is required to access the past and the future. We reflect on the past and we project into the future. In fact, there's no other way to access the future except through our imaginations. Unless someone out there has a secret time machine, of course we don't know, we don't think so. Otherwise, we're going to use our imaginations. We use books, movies, TVs, blogs, etc. to think about the past. And all of these help us process what has happened. And we also think about the future through science fiction, through forecasts, and even fortune telling and horoscopes. The future cannot be observed because it doesn't exist. It's a concept up here in our minds, but what does exist and what can be studied are people's perceptions of the future. And these perceptions can be collected and studied, and we can also study past events and current events and trends to guide us on possible futures. So thinking about the future is not about being right or wrong, it's just a way of inspecting our beliefs, disrupting the constraints of our current conceptions, and revealing our assumptions about what we believe and can and cannot, what we believe can or cannot happen. To take an extreme example of futures thinking, the Finnish, when investigating the consequences of establishing a site to store their nuclear waste, had to think out as far as 100,000 years into the future, exploring how they would prepare a site so that it would not be disturbed for the hazardous life of the radioactive spent fuel. No structure in human history has stayed standing for such a period, let alone a society lasted for anything close to that long. They couldn't even be sure if language as we know it today would still exist. So this complex scenario exercise involved a diverse group of physicists to faith leaders. It was brought together in the film. There's a film there and I put a link to it. It's called Into Eternity. And it's an example of how far futures can be pushed. Now, as I mentioned, I've added a link to that. It's a fascinating documentary and you can see it in the resources there. And if they can imagine 100,000 years out into the future, then we can certainly imagine 10 years. In summary then, in this lecture we introduced the topic of futures thinking and the terminology used in the field. Futures thinking, foresight, strategic foresight, futuristics, future studies, futuring and futurology. So this course is going to use two of the most commonly used terms, futures thinking and strategic foresight, interchangeably. Now, practitioners in the field of futures thinking are known as futurists, and there are multiple potential futures. The future is not fixed. Futures thinking is not about trying to predict the future, but about trying to explore alternative futures so that we can change what we do today, so that we can move towards our preferred future. We can access futures through our imagination, and in this course, we take 10 years as the minimum time frame for futures thinking. So I hope you enjoyed that lecture. We've certainly covered a lot of ground. And in the next lecture, we're going to look at who might use futures thinking. So I'll see you in the next lecture.